Margaret Watson set her alarm for 5 o'clock every morning. As the head nurse in a Chicago children's ward, her day began earlier than most people's. Seeing the children's smiles was what gave her life meaning. Changing into her white uniform and taking a sip of coffee, Margaret gazed at the city view from her window. She had purchased this apartment 2 years ago, just a 15-minute walk from the hospital. Though not spacious, it was enough for her. The walls were decorated with handmade pictures and photographs given to her by the children. One photo in particular stood out, a picture with 12-year-old Sarah. Sarah Jenkins was brought to Margaret's ward when she was diagnosed with leukemia 2 years ago. At 10 years old, she had lost her parents in a car accident and had been moving between distant relatives' homes. During her treatment, Margaret cared for Sarah with special affection. When Sarah's hair fell out from chemotherapy, Margaret cut her own hair short and told her, "Now we match." Even after Sarah's leukemia miraculously went into remission, their bond continued as Sarah was taken in by a foster family. Recently, Margaret had begun seriously considering adopting Sarah. For a single woman without children, it was a major decision. However, her feeling of, "I want to protect this child," grew stronger with each passing day. Margaret's cell phone rang, and the screen showed "Mother." After a moment's hesitation, she pressed the answer button. "Maggie. How are you? Are you free this weekend?" Frances Watson's voice was more excited than usual. "Well, I don't have any special plans, why?" "Wonderful. We're having a barbecue in the backyard on Saturday. The whole family will be there. Can you come?" Margaret silently checked her calendar. Saturday was her birthday. It was unusual for her family to gather to celebrate her birthday. Normally, her birthday was marked with just a phone call or, at most, a simple dinner. Meanwhile, her sister Rebecca's birthday was celebrated lavishly every year. Margaret answered, "Should I bring anything?" "Nothing at all. Just yourself." After ending the call, Margaret felt conflicted. William and Frances Watson had always given special treatment to her sister Rebecca. A high school cheerleader and sorority darling in college, Rebecca was the perfect daughter in her parents' eyes. In contrast, Margaret's serious, introverted nature meant her efforts and achievements were always overshadowed. "When I became head nurse, Dad said, 'It's a shame you didn't aim to become a doctor,'" Margaret mumbled to herself. Her reputation at the hospital was excellent, and she was deeply trusted by her colleagues. Her best friend, Eleanor Green, was particularly supportive. Eleanor was Margaret's senior nurse. They had been close since their rookie days, often going to movies on weekends or sometimes having dinner with Eleanor's brother James. James was a 45-year-old architect and single. Margaret felt somewhat drawn to his quiet, warm personality. Next door to Margaret's apartment lived Edna Miller. After losing her husband, Edna had continued living alone, and she and Margaret had built a special relationship. They occasionally shared dinner and walked in the park on holidays. Edna was like the ideal mother figure to Margaret. "Maggie, you are wonderful enough. Don't doubt your own worth," Edna often told her. Margaret looked at the clock and quickly grabbed her bag. Today was going to be busy. 3 new patients were being admitted to the hospital, and there was a staff meeting. And after school, Sarah was coming to visit Margaret's apartment. While riding the elevator, Margaret thought about the family gathering this weekend. If her parents had remembered her birthday, that would be a pleasant change. But recalling past disappointments, she cautioned herself not to expect too much. This time might be different, Margaret whispered softly as she stepped out into the morning air of Chicago. Saturday morning, Margaret dressed more carefully than usual. She chose a pale blue dress and styled her hair meticulously. She applied makeup a bit heavier than normal. Pausing in front of the mirror, she contemplated her reflection. 38 years old. Not young anymore, but she reminded herself that she still had life ahead of her. "Today will be a good day," Margaret whispered. "Even if it's not, I have my own life." On the table lay gifts for her parents. For her father William, a fine wine, and for her mother Frances, her favorite perfume. Being invited to a family gathering on a special day was unusual, and she couldn't suppress her mixed feelings of expectation and anxiety. At 2 in the afternoon, Margaret arrived at her parents' house. The two-story house in a quiet Chicago suburb was where she had grown up. Colorful flowers bloomed in the front yard, and laughter could be heard from the backyard. As she got out of the car, a familiar scent tickled her nose, the smell of her father's prized barbecue sauce. Margaret took a deep breath before ringing the doorbell. The door opened, and her father William appeared. "Hey, Maggie. You came." He smiled, looking slightly awkward. "Hello, Dad." Margaret held out a gift bag. "This is for you, if you'd like." "Thank you. Everyone's in the backyard." "Go ahead." Stepping into the backyard, Margaret was greeted by a scene beyond her imagination. A large table had been set up with elaborate decorations. Smoke rose from the barbecue grill, where William's best friend George was in charge of the cooking. The table was laden with lavish food, and bottles of champagne were being chilled. Margaret couldn't hide her surprise. Such a grand party hadn't been held, in her memory, since her sister Rebecca's college graduation celebration. About 20 people had gathered, including relatives and family friends. Her mother's sister Beth and Uncle Tom were there, as well as cousins from her father's side. As Margaret entered the backyard, her mother Frances rushed over. "Maggie. I'm so glad you came. What a lovely dress." Frances embraced her daughter. "Thank you, Mom. This is for you." "Oh, you didn't have to." Frances accepted the gift and set it aside. "Now, go say hello to everyone. Rebecca is over at the table." Looking around, Margaret saw Rebecca seated at the head of the table, telling something to the people around her. As usual, she was the center of attention. Margaret smiled and approached her sister. "So you came." Rebecca stood up and gave Margaret a light hug. "What do you think of the decorations?" "I picked everything out myself." "It's really impressive," Margaret answered honestly. Rebecca's husband Michael also came over to greet Margaret. He was a corporate executive, always dressed in expensive suits. Margaret had mixed feelings about Michael. He was polite, but there was something distant about him. The party progressed pleasantly, and Margaret gradually relaxed. Relatives asked about her work and were impressed by her achievements as head nurse. For Margaret, who was often out of the spotlight, it was a refreshing experience. "Maggie, your work is truly wonderful," Aunt Beth said. "It must be difficult, but you're saving children's lives, aren't you?" "Thank you, Aunt Beth." Margaret felt touched. "It is challenging, but rewarding." As time passed, Margaret's expectations grew. She began to believe that such a grand party might indeed be to celebrate her birthday. Taking a glass of champagne, she approached her mother. "Mom, this is a lovely party." "Yes, it's a special day," Frances replied happily. Hearing those words, Margaret's heart leaped. A special day. So they had remembered her birthday after all. Overcome with emotion, words escaped her lips. "You remembered my birthday?" Margaret looked at her mother with an expression full of hope. Frances's expression changed instantly. Her face showed a mixture of surprise and confusion, sending a wave of anxiety through Margaret. "Oh. Is that today?" Frances's eyes widened. "This is to celebrate Rebecca's pregnancy." Those words felt like cold water thrown on Margaret's chest. For a moment, all surrounding sounds seemed to fade away. "Pregnancy celebration?" "Yes, Rebecca is pregnant with her first child. She's 3 months along now, so we're announcing it to everyone today." "Didn't you know?" Margaret couldn't answer. Her mind went blank, and she stood frozen. From a distance, she could hear Rebecca's giggles. Turning around, she saw her sister with a malicious smile. "Oh, my sister always thinks about herself," Rebecca said loud enough for those around to hear. She thought it was her birthday. A ripple of laughter spread among the relatives. Margaret felt her face grow hot with embarrassment and frustration. Her father William approached and placed a hand on her shoulder. "Maggie, I did remember your birthday." It's just. William faltered, his expression uncomfortable. It's okay, Dad, Margaret forced a smile. Congratulations, Rebecca. That's wonderful news. Contrary to her words, tears welled up in Margaret's eyes. It felt as though years of disappointment and hurt were flooding over her at once. She quietly set down her glass and left the backyard without anyone noticing. On her way to the front door, Margaret ducked into a small washroom. Looking at her reflection in the mirror, she tried to take deep breaths. Stay calm, she told herself. But her emotions became overwhelming, and tears began streaming down her cheeks. No one would notice her absence. Everyone would be caught up in the excitement of Rebecca's pregnancy news. Margaret grabbed her handbag and left the house without saying goodbye to anyone. Once in her car, tears flowed uncontrollably. With her forehead against the steering wheel, Margaret cried for a long time. For 38 years, she had always been second best, always in the shadows. No matter how hard she tried, no matter her successes, she remained invisible in her family's eyes. Enough is enough, Margaret whispered as she wiped away her tears. This is the last disappointment. I won't expect anything anymore. As she started the car, Margaret made a resolution. From now on, she would focus on her own life. She would seriously pursue adopting Sarah and create her own family. There must be something more precious than blood ties. Driving toward Chicago, along with sadness and anger, a new determination began to sprout in Margaret's heart. 3 weeks had passed since the birthday incident. Margaret had immersed herself in work to distract from the pain in her heart. New patients were continuously being brought into the children's ward of Chicago Children's Hospital, and her days as head nurse were becoming increasingly busy. Maggie, you've been working overtime for 3 days straight. Don't push yourself too hard, Eleanor placed a hand on Margaret's shoulder with a concerned look. I'm fine. Being busy helps me take my mind off things, Margaret tried to smile, but it was strained from fatigue. Eleanor sighed. Why don't you come over for dinner tonight? My brother James will be there. He's been asking about you a lot lately. Margaret thought for a moment and then nodded. Thank you. I'm happy to be invited after so long. That evening, after finishing her shift, Margaret headed to Eleanor's apartment. When she opened the door, the aroma of a warm dinner greeted her. In the living room, James was reading a book, waiting for her arrival. Hi, Margaret. How have you been? James stood up from the sofa and smiled warmly at her. Well, you know, Margaret answered honestly. Work has been busy. James looked at Margaret with a serious expression. I heard from Eleanor. About your family. That's harsh. Margaret looked away. I'm used to it. But this time. I guess I had expectations. During dinner, Margaret spoke openly about her family for the first time. The comparisons with her sister since childhood, her parents' indifference, and the birthday incident. As she spoke, occasionally tearing up, James quietly held her hand. I've decided, Margaret announced at the end of her story. I'm going to formally pursue Sarah's adoption. I don't care about my family's opinion anymore. I think that's a wonderful decision, James replied with a serious expression. Let me know if there's anything I can do to help. The next day, Margaret visited Sarah's foster home. However, shocking news awaited her. Sarah had been returned to the facility from her foster home. The foster couple said she was too much to handle and had given her up. What do you mean? Sarah is not a problem child. Margaret couldn't contain her anger. Ms. Watson, please calm down, Jennifer Morris from Child Welfare Services said quietly. Sarah is now at St. Mary's facility. Actually, she's been asking to see you. That afternoon, Margaret visited St. Mary's Children's Care Facility. Sarah, who had been waiting at the end of the hallway, ran to her as soon as she saw Margaret. Margaret. You came. The girl clung to her with tears in her eyes. Of course, Sarah. I won't leave you alone, Margaret embraced Sarah, fighting back her own tears. What happened? Sarah looked down. I was a bad girl. I got angry when David the foster father tried to throw away my drawings. They were drawings I made with the art supplies you gave me. Anger welled up in Margaret's chest. The more she heard Sarah's story, the clearer it became that the foster home had been inappropriate. As she was leaving, Margaret approached Jennifer. I want to apply for adoption. Formally. Are you sure? Jennifer asked with a surprised expression. As a single mother, with your busy job? I'm sure, Margaret replied with unwavering determination. I need Sarah, and Sarah needs me. Jennifer thought for a moment and then nodded. All right. Let's start the application process. But the screening will be strict. Over the next few weeks, Margaret was busy with work and adoption preparations. She prepared the spare room in her apartment for Sarah and requested schedule adjustments at the hospital. Supporting her through this were Eleanor, James, and her neighbor Edna. Maggie, you're a strong woman, Edna said one evening while having tea in Margaret's apartment. Choosing your own path is never easy. Edna, I'm truly grateful to have you, Margaret responded with heartfelt words. You're more of a mother to me than my own family. Edna smiled gently. There are things more precious than blood ties. You and Sarah are already connected in your hearts. At the end of July, Margaret was visiting the Chicago Art Museum at James's invitation. Their relationship had gradually deepened, developing into something more than friendship. About Sarah, James brought up while gazing at a painting. I'd like to meet her too. Really? Margaret was surprised. That would be wonderful. Sarah would be delighted. I like children. Especially those interested in art. James, as an architect, was passionate about art education. The following weekend, Margaret, James, Eleanor, and Edna visited St. Mary's together. Sarah immediately warmed up to James, her eyes shining as she listened to his stories about architecture. Margaret, is he your boyfriend? Sarah asked with a curious expression. Well, we're not exactly in that kind of relationship yet, Margaret blushed slightly. But we might be, James answered playfully, making Margaret's heart skip a beat. By mid-August, the adoption screening was in its final stage. The home visit had been completed without issues, and Margaret's financial situation and compatibility with Sarah were judged to be satisfactory. All that remained was the final interview. Tomorrow is the final interview. Margaret lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. If this goes well, Sarah will officially become my daughter. She was surprised at her own words. Daughter. For the first time, the realization of becoming a mother to a young girl took root within her. With mixed feelings of anxiety and anticipation, Margaret fell asleep. The next morning, she was awakened by an urgent call from the hospital. Ms. Watson, the voice of Dr. David Clark, a pediatrician, came through the phone. I'm calling about Sarah. Margaret's heart nearly stopped. Sarah? Did something happen? There's a possibility her leukemia has relapsed. She was brought in last night with a high fever and fatigue. We're running tests now. The moment she hung up the phone, Margaret's legs gave way. The ray of hope that had finally appeared seemed to be covered in darkness again. But she quickly stood up. This was no time for tears. Sarah needed her strength. When she rushed to the hospital, Sarah was sleeping in a small bed. Her complexion was poor, and N4 was in her arm. Outside the room, Eleanor was already waiting with a worried expression. Maggie, I heard. Are you all right? I don't know, Margaret answered honestly. But I need to be strong for Sarah. By early afternoon, James and Edna had also arrived at the hospital. The four waited outside Sarah's room for the test results. When Dr. Clark returned, his expression was grim. I'm sorry, but the leukemia relapse has been confirmed. However, since we've caught it earlier than before, there is hope for treatment. Margaret took a deep breath. What kind of treatment is needed? We'll restart chemotherapy, and depending on the situation, we might consider a bone marrow transplant. If there's a match among blood relatives, the success rate increases. Test my bone marrow, Margaret responded immediately. Even though we're not blood related, is there a possibility? Yes, we'll certainly test you. However, the match rate isn't as high as with blood relatives. James stepped forward. I'll get tested too. And Eleanor. Edna also said in a weak voice, I'll do whatever I can as well. Margaret's heart swelled with gratitude. These people, not related by blood, were so deeply concerned about her and Sarah. Meanwhile, there had been no contact from her actual family. When Sarah awoke, 4 people surrounded her. Everyone, you came? Sarah smiled weakly. Of course, Sarah, Margaret gripped the girl's hand. We're your family. At those words, Eleanor, James, and Edna nodded. Though there were no blood ties, there was undoubtedly a family present. Margaret renewed her resolve. Saving Sarah and teaching her the warmth of a true family, that was her mission now. 2 weeks had passed since Sarah's leukemia relapse. Although the treatment was progressing well, Dr. Clark repeatedly mentioned the possibility of a bone marrow transplant. Margaret had her bone marrow tested, but unfortunately, the compatibility rate was low. The results were similar for James and Eleanor. We need to know detailed medical history of the family, Dr. Clark told Margaret. Do you have any information about Sarah's biological family? Very little, Margaret's shoulders drooped. Her parents died in an accident, and records about other relatives are scarce. I see. Dr. Clark pondered. Well, let's continue the current treatment while looking for other donor candidates. As Margaret was leaving the hospital, her smartphone rang. Looking at the screen, she saw Rebecca displayed. After a moment's hesitation, remembering that there had been several calls from her parents in the past few weeks, she decided to answer. Hello? Finally, you answer the phone. Rebecca's voice had a slight edge. Everyone's been worried. Is that so? Margaret replied, suppressing her emotions. What do you want? Mom and Dad want to see you. Since you've been ignoring their calls, they asked me to contact you. Margaret took a deep breath. I'm busy right now. At the hospital with a very important patient. Always running away like that, Rebecca's voice turned cold. Work over family. I've decided to take leave for my baby. Because I think family comes first. Those words made anger rise within Margaret. But her mind was full of thoughts about Sarah. Rebecca, I'll call you back later. After hanging up, Margaret began thinking about the family medical information needed for Sarah's treatment. Her parents might know something. Setting aside her own feelings, she decided to visit her parents' home for Sarah's sake. The next afternoon, Margaret parked her car in front of her parents' house. When she rang the doorbell, her mother Frances immediately opened the door. Maggie. Frances's face showed surprise and joy. Well, you finally came. We were worried. In the living room sat her father William and Rebecca. Margaret exchanged brief greetings and got straight to the point. I want to ask about our family's medical history. Medical history? William frowned. Did something happen? Margaret briefly explained about Sarah. The leukemia relapse, the course of treatment, and the possibility of a bone marrow transplant. So, I want to know if there's any family history of genetic diseases. Can you think of anything? Frances and William exchanged glances. Is this for that child you're trying to adopt? Rebecca interjected. Yes, it is, Margaret answered firmly. You're planning to adopt a child without consulting us, your family? Frances's voice carried a tone of accusation. Margaret tried to maintain her composure. Sarah is a precious child. Like family to me. I want to help her. But there's no blood relation, Rebecca said. Real family is connected by blood. Those words pushed Margaret's anger to its limit. Real family? What you've done to me is family. Forgetting my birthday and celebrating Rebecca's pregnancy instead? We've already apologized for that, Frances said defensively. You've been ignoring our calls. Apologized? When? Margaret was surprised. I left a voicemail. Since you didn't answer. Margaret shook her head. That doesn't matter now. What matters is Sarah. Will you tell me about our family's medical history or not? William sighed. All right. My father had heart disease, and my mother had breast cancer. I don't think there were any special genetic diseases. Francis provided similar information. Margaret carefully noted everything down. Thank you. I'll be going now. Wait, Francis grabbed her arm. Tell us more about this child. If she's so important to you, we want to know about her. After a moment's hesitation, Margaret showed them a photo of Sarah on her smartphone. She's 12 years old. A strong girl fighting leukemia. She lost her parents in an accident and has been moving between facilities and foster homes. Francis and William looked at the photo, but their expressions were complex. She's a cute girl, Francis said, but her voice lacked genuine warmth. But with our grandchild on the way, to take in someone else's child. Someone else's child? Margaret raised her voice. Sarah is not someone else's child. She's precious to me. Rebecca took the smartphone and scrolled through Sarah's photos. But as a single mother with a job, isn't it difficult to take care of a sick child? I have people who support me. Eleanor, James, Edna. They are my family. At those words, the three clearly showed displeasure. You call people not related by blood family? Francis said indignantly. Margaret stood up and grabbed her bag. Yes, I do. Family is bound by love and support. Not just by blood. As she was leaving, Rebecca chased her to the entrance. Do you really think you can be happy with that? She said in a sarcastic tone. Are you satisfied with a stray child because you can't have your own children? Margaret stared at Rebecca. Sarah is not a stray child. She is the daughter of my heart. You wouldn't understand. Getting into her car, Margaret left her parents' home. As expected, she didn't receive true understanding from her blood relatives. But that only strengthened her resolve. Sarah's treatment was showing signs of recovery better than expected. There were indications of improvement even without a bone marrow transplant. At the same time, Margaret's adoption application had entered its final stage. Congratulations, Maggie, Jennifer Morris announced with a bright smile. The review committee has approved your application. All that's left is processing the final paperwork. Margaret couldn't stop her tears of joy. When she shared the news with Sarah in the hospital room, the girl smiled broadly despite her weakness. Really? Margaret, you're going to be my mom? Yes, Sarah. We'll be together from now on. That evening, Margaret held a small celebration with Eleanor, James, and Edna. James took Margaret's hand and said quietly, Maggie, you're going to be a wonderful mother. Thank you. But I couldn't do it alone. I have all of you. Late that night, Margaret made a big decision. She began writing a long post on social media. Titled, Birth of a New Family, Bonds Beyond Blood, she chronicled her journey from meeting Sarah to the adoption. She attached the adoption approval document and a photo of herself with Sarah, James, Eleanor, and Edna at the hospital. Today, I officially became a mother. I welcomed a precious daughter connected not by blood, but by heart. And I am blessed with a wonderful family who supports me. Thank you to everyone who taught me that love is a choice, not a blood relation. The morning after publishing the post, Margaret's smartphone was flooded with notifications. Warm congratulatory messages came from many people. And there was also a call from her mother. She didn't answer that call. Now was the time to begin her new life with Sarah. A year had passed. Under the clear June sky, Margaret and James's wedding ceremony was being held in a small church in suburban Chicago. Colorful flowers bloomed in the church garden, and Margaret's wedding dress shone brilliantly white. Mom, you look beautiful, Sarah said with a recovered, healthy smile. She was wearing a pale pink dress as a bridesmaid. Thank you, Sarah, Margaret gently kissed her daughter's cheek. You look wonderful too. The wedding was small but wrapped in a warm atmosphere. Eleanor was the maid of honor, and Edna attended as a special guest. Colleagues from the hospital came to celebrate, as did staff from St. Mary's Children's Care Facility and Jennifer Morris. When the officiant declared Margaret and James married, warm applause erupted from the venue. After their first kiss, James pulled Sarah close, and the three embraced. An indescribable bond had formed there. The week after the wedding, Margaret and James completed the formal adoption process for Sarah. The girl, now with her new name, Sarah Watson Green, would walk through life from now on with her two parents. Margaret posted wedding photos and family photos with Sarah on social media with the caption, "Bonds Beyond Blood. The family I chose." That post received more response than expected, with many people commenting their sympathy about what true family means. Her story was featured in local news and became a catalyst for connecting children in similar situations with prospective adoptive parents. Meanwhile, her blood relatives were not doing well. Rebecca struggled with postpartum depression after giving birth, and her husband Michael didn't provide adequate support. Her parents, William and Frances, were too preoccupied with concerns about their own aging to help with Rebecca's childcare. When they learned of Margaret's marriage and adoption, they initially reacted with anger and jealousy. Rebecca spread rumors saying, "My sister brought a stray child into her home," and her parents condemned Margaret's choice as a betrayal of family. However, as support for Margaret grew in the community, the blood relatives gradually became socially isolated. 6 months later, a letter arrived for Margaret from Frances. It contained words of apology and a wish to meet Sarah. Margaret put the letter before a family council. After discussing with Sarah, James, Eleanor, and Edna, they decided to propose a conditional resumption of relations. "Sarah might need loving grandparents too," Margaret wrote in her reply. "However, if you ever hurt us again, I will cut ties permanently." The choice to maintain the possibility of reconciliation while protecting the bonds of her new family, that was the true strength Margaret had found.